Welcome to Beat Everyone. I'm Ben Flanagan with AL.com. Glad to have you back with us. So, we know Alabama fans are rabid, they're loyal, and they love tradition. And sometimes they go pretty far with their love and obsession of the Crimson Tide. And our friend Nick Kelly is going to join us soon to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. But first, I'm joined again by Beat Everyone producer, our good friend Matt Scalisi. And we're feeling a little sentimental today. And Matt, we're here to talk about Alabama players we miss. So why don't you go ahead and tell the people what I mean by that?
Well, I think, Ben, we're looking back at those names that you know are regardless of the Alabama talent factory, and its sort of never ending supply of great players. There are some guys that just can't seem to be replaced, and there was just something different and special about them. And I think they're what I'm going for with my picks here anyway. These are these are guys that I would take in any incarnation. If you told me there was a player that was coming about that played exactly like them, I'd probably still be excited, but there was just something sort of unique about these individual guys, whether it was their talent or playing style, but also, kind of something about who they were, something about their personality and what they brought to the team.
Yeah, entertainment, right?
For
Like
sure.
the guys that I picked, and the way that I think we're doing this, Matt, is we're each going to take one offensive guy and one defensive guy, and then are we going for somebody who wasn't a football player who was
Yeah,
part of Alabama?
that's right.
Okay, well, so you know the format now, but for me too, it's just like who just brought it while they were at Alabama and somebody that I could have watched for the rest of my life, right? And it's always a shame being a college football fan how cyclical everything is when it comes to players, coaches, personalities. You only get so much time; it's finite with the people that you love to watch, and they move on, and you just hope that players and coaches who are come behind them can deliver what they did, whether that was in championships or entertainment value. And certainly, I think the guys that we pick here are going to have all of that rolled into one person and one career with each pick that we make. So, Matt, why don't you go first? Why don't we start offense?
All right. Uh Offensively, I mean there's a lot of guys that I consider to be all-time greats that have come through Alabama in the last, 2 decades here, and they've continued to be great players in the NFL. But I think for me, it's looking for, like I said, something that hasn't really been replaced other than this guy. And as great as all of the quarterbacks and wide receivers and running backs have been, and even perhaps offensive linemen, I think there have continued to be great players at those positions for Alabama. But the one that I think has not really ever had a successor is OJ Howard. And I think he brings, I mean, there was something about, situationally, he always seemed to be there with a huge play when they needed him the most. And I think a lot of that came down to the teams that he was on and the scheme that he was playing into. But OJ also, I mean, he executed and he came through, and he had incredible speed for a guy of his size. I also, we talk about the sort of personal side of it. I also just really love that story and it's kind of a throwback type of guy, but a guy who comes from an incredibly small school, impossibly small. OJ Howard went to Autauga Academy in Montgomery, or just outside of Montgomery. This is, I mean, I can't stress to you how small this school is. I don't think my kids have ever been to a school this small, all the way down to elementary. And OJ played essentially every position on his football team on both sides at various points. And a lot of people said a guy like that who's never really been going up against elite competition for most of his career, he's not gonna have a great college career, and he that turned out to not be the case. He was an incredibly productive tight end for Alabama. But I just think that that's one of those things that when you look back at it, both that aspect of the guy guy who's not from a powerhouse anymore. He didn't spend his whole childhood kind of in training to become a five-star athlete, but also just a guy at the tight end position who can do what he did and is as much of a threat as he was. I don't think Alabama has replaced it, and I do miss it. I miss having a big giant target like that who could blow a game open in one play.
Great player. We love OJ Howard. We had him on the show fairly recently. He was a great conversation, and the results speak for themselves, especially in the biggest games, right? I mean, he was obviously the offensive MVP of the 2015 college football playoff final against Clemson. Guys just wide open. He's still wide open, in fact, and he was wide open again the next year in
Mhm.
the rematch that Alabama ended up losing, but he was a big factor there and tried to help Alabama win back-to-back championships. And you're right. I mean, I just remember when they signed OJ Howard, how big a deal that was. And this
Yeah,
was already in the midst of Alabama's recruiting machine, already on top. And they could get pretty much any player they wanted, or at least Alabama was in a really good position, and fans didn't really need to worry about recruiting that they like they had in the past. They weren't like paying attention quite as closely on National Signing Day with bated breath with every single letter of intent that came through, because they knew that Nick Saban had things under control, and they could just kind of like sit there and just know that it's going to be a great class. Don't worry about it. But when they signed OJ Howard, it was like a big celebration because they got this generational recruit when it came to this position where Alabama hadn't really had a star, quote unquote. They had really talented tight ends throughout the years, and even
for
during the
sure.
Saban era, the Michael Williams, the Brad Smellies, these guys, Colin Peaks, these guys who were big time contributors and were championship players. But OJ Howard was something a little different, and was going to give Alabama's quarterbacks this target that they had seemingly never had, at least when it came to size and athleticism and speed. And OJ Howard had a long career, almost as equal of a celebration as when he decided to stick around for his senior season after he had that big showing against Clemson in the championship game that Alabama won. So OJ Howard, great pick there, and I'm sure a lot of Alabama fans also miss him. There have been some good tight ends. We talked to CJ Dupree on this show and enjoyed watching him play during the Saban and first year of DeBoer. I mean, even Jaleel Billingsley, before he transferred out of Alabama to Texas, he was a really entertaining guy to watch at the position. So we'll hope that
Irv
Josh
Smith did
Cuevas
some good things too. Yeah,
yeah, for sure. We'll hope that Josh Cuevas can do some things this season, and the tight ends that Alabama have can can measure up to what OJ Howard was able to do over the span of a 4-year career. Highly decorated player. So good pick there, Matt.
thanks, Ben. Who do you have for your offensive pick?
Anytime I get to talk about Jalen Waddle and look back on his career, I'm gonna do it. And I should probably retire him as a pick of mine moving forward, put him in a pantheon, so to speak. But it's absolutely wild to me that Jalen Waddle was never the number one receiver while he was at Alabama. It speaks to the level of recruiting at the position, and also just to the players who came in and played and did what they did and how productive they were. But I mean, he could have been the number one guy at literally any other SEC or power conference school. But I just want at this point to see a guy who is as dangerous as Jalen Waddle was with the ball in his hands. I mean, he had the speed, the twitch, the instinct, the vision. If he's on the field, literally anything can happen. Will Alabama have another playmaker like that in 2025? Will they ever have another playmaker like Jalen Waddle again in our lifetime? Like I've said it on the show ad nauseum before, but I feel like we really only scratched the surface with what all he could really do on the
Hmm.
field. But you know, we certainly in the Miami Dolphins saw all that we needed to know like what kind of a player Jalen Waddle really was. Unfortunately, an ankle injury ended up depriving us of what I think was about to be a potential All-American season from him, both as a receiver and as a return specialist. Remember, he went down against Tennessee early in the 2020 season, right? Can you imagine, Matt, Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith healthy all year
Yeah.
in
Well,
2020?
they might have won every single game by a large margin. but
forget about it, by a
they
larger
did
margin
a
than they
larger
won them, and
margin.
they won them by large
Yeah, I
margins,
mean,
right? But I
I
mean,
yeah, Ben, I mean, it's interesting because right around the same time, and maybe this is just an indicator of the fact this was like the high watermark for stockpiling talent. But you could also be describing Josh Jacobs a little bit, but just in a different position. Just that Alabama had reached this point where guys who are unquestionably NFL starters, which is an incredibly small number of people, that those guys were never the number one guy at their position at Alabama. And we can say that about guys at multiple different positions from right around that era. But I mean, Waddle is one of those where Ben, I have taught my TikTok algorithm well enough to know that it will serve me highlight reels of individual players. And there's a lot of people who are doing a great job with putting things like that together out there. And every time a Jalen Waddle highlight reel comes up for me, I'm gonna sit there and watch the whole thing all the way through because he was so uniquely fun. Even out of a group of players from Alabama, like wide receiver, where they have had truly an unbelievable collection of some of the best guys to ever do it there. You can kind of like, if you took the numbers off, I think you would know that it was Jalen Waddle. There was just something very unique and explosive about the way he played. Those deep balls where he just would suddenly, by the time the ball gets to him, he's like 15 yards away from the nearest guy. That ability to, I think, also make those quick changes of direction mid mid play after the catch, which I think is the same skill set that made him such a dangerous return man. And I think Ben, I'll say this: I think if he stays healthy, I think there you have a very solid debate about him being potentially the greatest return specialist Alabama has ever had.
yeah, for sure. I mean, when he finally got the ball, because there was only one ball to share with all the playmakers that they had during that era, but he is a guy who just had purpose when he had the ball. He was only moving with forward momentum and just looking ahead and wondering, how can I score on this play now that I have the ball? And more often than not, he would. And so he's just one of those guys. Like, if we're talking about players we miss, I miss that guy. If only because I never had more fun watching Alabama football than when Waddle was on the field. And another reason I miss him is just because I don't know that we saw all he could do, but with the time that we had with him, we certainly had a good time. So Waddle is my pick for the offensive cat. Let me go first in defense, Matt,
Okay.
and we'll let you finish out that category. So I'm going to go underrated with a defensive player that we miss. This guy played a position that we need to see excel again in Tuscaloosa. You had your Will Andersons, you had your Dallas Turners recently, you had your Jonathan Allens, your Quinnen Williams, these guys who got to the quarterback, these guys who made life hell for the offensive line and the offensive coordinators and the other head coach on the other side of the ball, disrupted everything that the offense was trying to do, affected the quarterback, to use a famous Nick Saban phrase, right? Give me Brandon Chicken himself. Give me Tim Williams, part of
Good
the
pick.
national championship defense in 2015, part of the historic 2016 unit known for all those non-offensive touchdowns. He even scored a non-offensive touchdown. Guy had 10 and a half sacks his junior year, and then 9 more his last season when he was sharing the field with guys like Jonathan Allen, Reuben Foster, Minka Fitzpatrick, Rashawn Evans, Deron Payne, Marlon Humphrey. I could keep going. Tim Williams had one job at 6'3", 244 pounds, get to the quarterback, and that guy was fast and he was stronger than he looked. I want to see a guy with a motor like Tim Williams had in Kane Womack's defense this year. I miss Tim Williams.
Yeah, I mean the look, I think the group they have right now, for the record, I think has a ton of potential, and I feel very good about them. But yeah, I mean, there was a level of dominance, I think, out of that 2016 group. And I will just tease, I have also picked a member of the 2016 defense for my for my pick. But giving giving uh giving him his due, I think we're talking about a group where there was, the one thing you remember the most, I think out of that particular team and that group of defenders, it's that, we always talk about defensive players, sometimes they don't show up on the stat sheet. This group showed up on the stat sheet. They made a lot of heavy impact plays, a lot of tackles for loss, a lot of turnovers, and of course, famously, a lot of actual scoring happened out of this group. And those things don't happen a ton because it requires a little bit of luck, but also requires a lot of overwhelming physical dominance, and just nobody could stack up against these guys. They were absolutely overmatching every offensive line they played against. And when there wasn't when there was extra protection brought in, right, to help out with this incredible front seven that was coming after you every single play, that secondary always held up too, including sometimes these linebackers dropping back into coverage who were very good at that. It was just a very versatile group. And they were all, I think, also played with a pretty nasty edge, that we can get into more in a minute here.
I love it. I mean, 2016 is just like the ideal defense in memory. I mean, 2011 was historic. People go back to 1992. There were some amazing Alabama defenses, but I mean that 2016 defense, like again, the non-offensive touchdown streak and total that they had, I am firmly convinced we're never going to see that again in our lifetimes. Like I just don't
It's
see
hard
it
to
happening.
imagine it happening again. Yeah.
So who's your player?
So my guy, as I said, is also was a big part of the 2016 defense, and mine in particular, I think I am choosing, and he did have a great stat line. Uh, in 2016 in particular, 61 tackles, 8.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, 3 pass deflections, and an interception return for a touchdown. Crazy huge line for this guy, stat line, up for his senior year. But I think the reason that I like and miss Ryan Anderson the most is because he was genuinely, like, he fit the bill. He played the part. When you're talking about, Ben, you and I are big movie guys. We were talking about the Cohen brothers recently and how they love having these sort of like menacing character actors, these like sort of big, terrifying looking dudes in all of their movies that are playing tough guys. And Ryan Anderson is that. Like, he looked angry all the time, and he was intimidating to talk to as a media member. And I honestly wouldn't say that about the vast majority of football players. As powerful as these dudes are, most of them are very professional, and Ryan Anderson was professional too. But Ryan Anderson just sort of put off a vibe, like, he was annoyed at you, and that was a bad thing. This is a person that if you are annoying to him, your body starts sending you danger signals. Um, and Ben, I know the one in particular moment that I always think about was uh, talking to him before a Sugar Bowl appearance. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. Which would have been, would it have been the 2016 season? What when would
Yes, it was
Alabama?
2016 season before they played Washington, and then they beat
Oh,
Washington
so that was
to
in the
go on to
Peach
play
Bowl then.
Clemson. What's
So
that?
so it was Atlanta. It was a Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl semifinal.
Maybe that's what it was.
That
I feel
might
like
be.
Sugar Bowl's right
You
though,
know, I was in a domed stadium doing media day.
but
That's all
you
I
were
really
talking to
remember.
him. Let's be
I was
clear about
talking. I
this.
was talking to him and asked him about this phenomenon that was starting to happen at the time of guys opting out of bowl games. And I remember that he seemed absolutely uh, annoyed at the entire premise of the question,
Disgusted.
and that I would even ask an Alabama player about it, because obviously it didn't apply to them, which is how he answered me. Basically said, where it's not a question for us because we're not playing in the Birmingham Biscuit Bowl. We're playing in a real bowl game, basically. But yeah, I mean, Ryan Anderson just had he had the mean mug and he had the stat line to go with it. Just a terrifying, brutal, defensive monster.
Hateful competitor,
Yeah.
right? That's a term that Saban has used before, and I think Ryan Anderson is the epitome of that idea. And yeah, I mean, it's so cool, Matt, that you are connected with him forever because you asked him that question, and he gave you what is one of I think one of the all time sound bites of the
Oh,
whole Saban era,
and that's what you
where
want. So many
that's it.
guys when we ask them about interesting, controversial things, they have a prepared answer they've thought about before. It's very diplomatic. They don't
Yep.
want to hurt anybody. They don't want to piss anybody off. Ryan Anderson did not care, and that's what you want as a journalist is somebody who has a strong opinion.
The Birmingham Biscuit Bowl, there like couldn't be a better combination of words to 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 explain like to illustrate the point that he was making. I think he even said like he may have even also followed that up with like the New Orleans Shrimp Bowl or something like that, which is just as good, but it's just like
For
it's
for
just
the
like
record,
it's
the 2016 Birmingham Bowl was between the South Florida Bulls and South Carolina.
but see like I don't think he was intending to like insult the teams that
I
made
don't
that
I don't
bowl,
think he was
but
either. No,
but he kind of did though anyway, like in the other bowls because it's like these things are beneath us and beneath
for sure.
Alabama and
I
like what Alabama is like striving towards every year. We compete for national championships and you'd be a fool and an insane person no matter what was on the line to sit out a game like this. That's just who he was, and he backed it up. He backed it up with his play,
I
like you
mean
said.
that those numbers. I mean everybody in that defense in 2016 has a crazy looking stat line that you would look at and say this guy must have been this guy must have been an All American, and
Yeah,
quite a few of them were actually All Americans, but it just was everybody there was so good and was so put in the right position to succeed that you could not, I mean, I'll bring up Will Anderson as a counter example, a guy who, like, in the later part of his career at Alabama, his stats didn't always look super great because teams started double teaming him, right? And you start accounting for him and say, "Well, let's let anybody other than this guy beat us." You couldn't do it in 2016 because everybody out there was capable of doing stuff like this. I mean, I think Ryan Anderson probably isn't even the first name that comes to mind for a lot of people out of that front seven. And we're talking about a guy who had 8.5 sacks and like 7 turnovers that he forced. Just a crazy, talented, productive group of guys.
yeah. Like you mentioned, there's a handful, a literal handful of first round picks on that team,
Hmm.
but there is nobody that you would rather have than Ryan Anderson and guys like Tim Williams for that matter, a guy like Javier Arenas, who I considered picking for this list, right? Guys who had these intangibles, who just were competitive as all hell, mean SOBs who just wanted to win and would do anything and everything they could to help the team win, to win championships, make plays. And again, like the proof is in the pudding. It's on the field. They laid it all out there. And Ryan Anderson is an outstanding example of that. So he was certainly on my short list of guys I miss, guys who, again, epitomize what an Alabama football player is, certainly on the defensive side of the ball. So he is getting at the definition of a player we as Alabama fans miss. So, Matt, this brings us to the non football player category here. Do you want to share your pick first?
Yeah, and I apologies in advance if I've taken yours, Ben. I think there's a really obvious one that I didn't go with here because he's the greatest coach in the history of college football, which felt like maybe that was a little on the nose. But I'm going with the guy, and I've thought this for many years, and it was only reinforced by the documentary that you can find on this channel, by the way, from our friend Clay Yeager. about Scott Cochran, a guy who I don't think was. I think it would be really reductive to just say that he was a strength coach at Alabama. He obviously did way more than that for the program. He became a face for the program in a lot of ways. He set the tone, uh, in terms of that toughness and the energy and the ferocity that these guys played with. Scott Cochran was such a huge part of that. And you'll hear so many players that were a part of the program during Saban's tenure talk about how when they had a problem, Scott Cochran was the guy that that dealt with it personally, that he was the guy you go to help you out with whatever you have going on. Not because Nick Saban didn't care, but because he's the CEO. He's got a million things going on. Scott Cochran sort of took it upon himself to be the guy who listens to whatever is going on with the players, and whether he needs to help you out with, emotional stuff, advice, if you're having issues with your family, if you need something resolved, that is keeping you from focusing on, your career and your job as a player. Scott Cochran was the guy who took it upon himself to head up the effort. But also just, Ben, that there's really I don't know that there's any other guys who were not a coordinator, at least, who had the kind of impact on a program that Scott Cochran had on Alabama.
Scott Cochran's my pick too, Matt. So we have the same pick. So you're right. I mean, next to Saban, Cochran was the face and voice of the Alabama football program. And with respect to the other schools out there, nobody else had anyone quite like Cochran and what he brought. You're right, not only as a strength coach, but just as a personality and ultimately a brand at the university, as a recruiting tool, as a coaching tool, as somebody who just did so much more than what his job description would suggest. I mean, you had this loud Louisiana born strength coach who brought this energy not just to the weight room, but he helped build a championship culture, and he brought it to Bryant Denny Stadium, like beyond the weight room to the entire stadium and state. I mean, whose voice did you hear in the building when they wanted to hype the crowd up, right? Like it wasn't Bryant, it wasn't Saban, it was Scott Cochran's
Mhm.
trademark yeah, 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 yeah chant, right? Telling the fans to get their hands up for the fourth quarter, jumping up and down, never tired. I mean, he was a total maniac. I mean, he was always turned up to 11. Scott Cochran was, again, a huge part of the culture that Nick Saban had developed in Tuscaloosa. I mean, this was one that pushed players beyond their limits, kept fans entertained along the way. I certainly miss what Scott Cochran brought to the program. And he's now the head coach over at West Alabama.
Mhm.
And you plug this as you should have. AL.com has a brand new documentary about him on this very same YouTube page. So you make sure you go watch that. You keep an eye on what Scott Cochran and several former Alabama football players who make up his staff are up to in his first season there. But I think it's inarguable who Scott Cochran was and what he did for Alabama. You know, he left and he went and coached for Georgia, and everybody, knows part of his story. And you'll get to know the full story if you watch this documentary on our channel. But
And if
Cochran
you're
has an
I'll just
amazing,
say, if you're an audio listener, I will also put the link
yeah, please
in the
do.
podcast notes
It's
too. So just
amazing work
scroll
by
down
our
and find that.
good friend Clay Yeager in the AL.com sports video team. They do tremendous work. But yeah, Cochran is somebody who was difficult to replace. Now, and Saban certainly did his best, and Alabama has a well-oiled machine going. And we heard from Kalen DeBoer himself to let us know that he's never seen players as in shape as they are going into the 2025 season, and he has full confidence in that aspect of the program and the staff that he's building. But again, it went beyond that. And I think like once Scott Cochran left, it was honestly a component that Saban and sort of the end to his era was missing down the stretch. And it's something that I think a lot of fans
I
miss to this
I
point.
think I think if you read between the lines, Ben, and you hear about the sort of the parts of things the parts of the job that Saban talked about just being, you know, I don't want to say unenjoyable, but just that it became too difficult for him to handle and keep up with. It's player relations basically. It's the kind of stuff that Scott Cochran did for the program, and that we've heard so many former players say that Cochran was the guy to go to for that stuff. I think being a great strength coach makes a big difference for the team, but I think being a guy that players feel like they can personally relate to and that they trust to have their best intentions at heart and to try to make things better for them, that is pretty irreplaceable. That is a huge part of why Alabama was so successful and so stable in a period of college football when even other championship programs could not maintain that kind of stability for very long.
Yeah, and I remember thinking throughout the years, especially early in the tenure when we were getting to know Scott Cochran and just how like loud and brash and full of energy he was. And I think that it was like overwhelming for a lot of people at first because they hadn't seen anything like this guy in recent years, certainly not during the Shula or Franchione or DeBose eras. And then here comes Saban, and we all know what Saban's personality is like. And I remember being kind of surprised, like, why would Saban, somebody as kind of like serious and stoic in some ways, as him, hand the keys, hand the reins over to someone like Scott Cochran with the just enormous personality and volume that he had. But to your point, it was just all about understanding how to speak the language of the players and how to make them comfortable and how to give them somebody
Yeah.
who can speak directly to them and get them hyped in ways that Saban might not have been able to.
Yeah,
And
I
it was
think
just
in
so
some
it was
ways
so cool. It was so cool that Saban understood that we need a personality like that for this place to succeed.
in some ways, Cochran was kind of the right brain, and it allowed Saban to be the left brain of the program.
Yeah, very cool. Well, those are our picks for players and people we miss. In terms of non-football players, other honorable mentions, Terry Saban, I think, is somebody who a lot of people miss
Absolutely.
in Tuscaloosa, somebody who you talk about the person behind the program. I don't think behind is the right word. I think she was the program almost
Mhm.
as much as Nick Saban was. I mean, she was instrumental in the success, and she obviously did so much off the field for the community and was so relatable and is somebody that people really adore and miss now that the Sabans are not part of the program in the same way that they were. You know, if you want to go back even further, the late great Mal Moore, I think, is somebody that people really miss. The person who was directly responsible for making the plea and pitch to Nick Saban to be the coach at
A-
Alabama, and
and
he obviously.
was a guy who you knew. I mean, not that there's doubts about a person who does that job because they're paid to do it, but Mal Moore was he was a Gump like us. He was a Bama guy through and through. He had played for the team. He knew what it all meant, and I think that makes an impact. I think it makes a difference.
Yep, for sure. You want people who understand this place, this tradition. Again, and we're about to get into tradition. Right now, we're going to go to our good friend, Nick Kelly of AL.com. So hang on for just a minute, and we'll be right back with a conversation with our pal, Nick. Okay, let's bring in our good friend and AL.com Alabama beat writer, Nick Kelly, who just launched a very interesting and entertaining project on the website. Alabama fans know about tradition. And one of them in this state is loving Alabama football so much that you can't help but name your kids after it, apparently. That's what his new series, Names in Crimson Flame, is all about. Nick, welcome back. Congrats on the new series. I know that you started down this road a long time ago. So, first, I want you to take us back to what led you there in the first place. As somebody who has covered Alabama for several years now, this is something new for you.
Yeah, this has been a project that I've wanted to do for some time, and this is going to be my fifth season on the beat this coming fall. And I had heard years ago. So my wife Elizabeth is a Birmingham native, and told me that there was someone named Crimson Ann White who grew up in Homewood, and I thought that was awesome. And to me, as someone who's not from here, I thought what a great way that encapsulates just how important football is to this state and this fan base. And so I kind of filed that away, but then finally had the chance this summer to do this project that I've been wanting to do for a while, because Crimson and White, even though that is a unique name, she's not alone in having a name related to Alabama football. And then you hear other stories, you hear other things, and you start getting into data, birth certificates, social security information. I should say I don't have their numbers, but they have tallies of people with certain names that you can access. And so you start getting those tallies, and you find that this is a bit of a phenomenon. I don't know if it's statistically significant, but it is something that is not a one off.
Well, if you read the stories that you wrote or you watch the video feature produced by our colleagues Anissa Latham Brown and Will McClelland, people like Crimson and White, who's now married and has dropped the white, right? But it was born Crimson and White, and you have these brothers Saban and Tide Witt. They seem to have a solid sense of humor, but also sense of pride when it comes to these names. Like they wear the names well, and they don't mind their permanent connections to Alabama football, do they?
No, I think that's the thing. They recognize that, yeah, it's definitely out there a little bit more than maybe John or Sally or something that's a bit more basic or traditional. But I think they can also smile about it and realize that it frankly is a conversation starter. It's something that people want to talk about, something that people would like to ask about and have some fun with. And so, in some ways, it is fun for them to have those names. And now they mentioned that, yeah, there are times where maybe it takes 10 times longer to get through something like Crimson Ann White. She talked about how a maybe 5 minute phone call with the bank turned into a 30-minute phone call once they hear her name. So things can take a little bit longer, but I think at the same time, yeah, it does lend itself to, like, one anecdote that didn't make the story with Crimson and White. She went through Rush at Alabama, which I should also note her first application went to Auburn for school, which would have been wild if she went to Auburn, but she went to Alabama. So she goes through Rush, and that night she goes back to her dorm room. After the first night, she had hundreds of Facebook notifications, hundreds. We're talking all these people who had heard her name, and even recently, Crimson and White, or Crimson and Revis is her name now, she ran into someone in Vestavia who said she remembered her, and this is Rush, I believe, in 2011 or 2013, something like that. So I mean, it sticks with people. So people want to talk about it, and I think that the people with these names, they didn't choose it, but they kind of roll with the punches and really just have some fun with it, and realize that, yeah, it's a conversation starter.
So this piece and this series has some pretty serious data too. Y'all crunch some numbers to find just how many people are named after Alabama football. And you came up with some pretty amazing results. And we're not going to get into everything. People need to read this and really dive into it to understand it. But Nick, what would you say, if you want to tease it, was the wildest stat you found during this part of the reporting?
That's a good question. There were some wild ones. I mean, Bryant was, of course, the most popular. That wasn't a surprise. But I think the most surprising thing to me, Ben, was figuring out that Bryant reached its peak of popularity as a first name during the Saban regime. So it wasn't during the time that Coach Bryant was coaching Alabama all those years. It actually increased when he died, and then it had some ups and downs. But then by the time Saban won a national championship, it was at its most popular that's ever been in the state. That to me was fascinating. So it's not just, okay, there's more Sabans in the state now because Nick Saban's having success. Now, I mean, yes, that was the case. I think there were 37 Sabans born over his time coaching Alabama. So there were a few, but actually the numbers of other names like Crimson, like Bryant, they increased as well. And there was even a few Tuas and Bamas mixed in there. So you could find a big variety of names connected to Alabama football.
Yeah, we know too. I mean, like pet names are pretty common when it comes to football names. I mean, whether it's there are probably a lot of Bamas and even Sabans and Bryants and things like that. But I mean, it's different here, right? Like we hear the SEC motto all the time. It just means more. I mean, that's obviously true in a lot of ways for Alabama specifically when it comes to naming their kids. So we know we've read a couple of pieces today, Nick. We've seen this video, but we know that this is a series. There's more to come. What all is next? Like, what can people expect from Nick Kelly and AL.com when it comes to this Names and Crimson Flame series?
Yeah, there's going to be another deep dive into Saban and Tide Witt, those brothers you talked about, kind of their more of their story. It was touched on a little bit in the first piece, but we're going to go more in depth as to how they got their names and what their lived experience is like with those names. Because frankly, it's something that a lot of people can't relate to. So it was really fascinating hearing about what it was like being named Saban during the height of his dynasty, because that Saban Witt was born in 2007. So he really only knew until last year Nick Saban coaching Alabama, his namesake. So talking about their experience. Then we also look at how the name Bryant has not only been popular in this state, but it's expanded past the borders of Alabama. And so looking at that, and then also looking at the popularity of the name Saban and how he has influenced naming the state, the popularity of Nicholas, things like that. So those are the other pieces to look for in the project.
Yeah, man, I can't wait to dive into it even more than we already have. It's so fascinating. Like Alabama fan culture to me just never gets old. And I wonder if somebody who's not from the state of Alabama, whether it's the names or something else that has surprised you, like what was the biggest or what has been the biggest culture shock for you as somebody covering Alabama sports and really Alabama what is Alabama culture? Nick, like what really threw you for a loop once you like moved here and immersed yourself in this place?
Man, I how about this? I'll tell you a few stories that have been some of my most favorite and just most you're in Alabama type of deal. You're in the heart of SEC country. One of them, family friend that we know on my wife's side, because my wife, like I said, is from Birmingham. They are huge Alabama fans, and they made sure every year growing up that they would buy all the Christmas gifts for their kids before the Iron Bowl. Why, you ask? Well, in case Alabama lost the Iron Bowl, they would give them half their gifts. So they were less sad after losing the Iron Bowl, which to me is peak fan culture and peak Iron Bowl, peak Alabama fan. It's just, I thought that was awesome when I heard that.
I love that.
And then there was also a time where at Thanksgiving when I was dating my now wife, where there's a relative there that uh, definitely on the older side, I think in her 90s, and this was back in 2022, I believe. And so Alabama had just lost to Tennessee not long before in October. So but a few weeks between Thanksgiving and that game. Well, this woman did not have the best hearing, didn't have the best eyesight. But when she found out I was a sports writer, wanted to talk about how bad the officiating was in the Tennessee game, which I thought was awesome. Being able to do that, talk about that with her, and have someone care so much. I mean, that to me, Ben, is what makes it stand out. Is how much football and Alabama football and on the other side Auburn football mean to people in this state, because people don't just care about it one day a week. They care about it all year round. They care about it every single day of the week. And for my job as a beat writer, it makes it so fun. I kind of call it my party trick of being able to talk about it. So I love to be able to talk to people about it and have people care, because the worst thing I think in our business is apathy.
Did you ever have kind of like a freak out moment though, like where you thought, "Oh my gosh, like I'm coming from a different part of the country. Look what I've married into, and I'm going to live in Alabama, and now it's like this is my life now." You know, has that ever happened? I'm just curious as somebody
Yeah,
who's from this
I mean,
place.
I can't think of one. I don't know if this is turning into a slight like Alabama football therapy session here, Ben. But no, I can't quite think of a freak out moment, but I, I mean, I love it because I love football, so it fits well. But one thing that stood out to me from the very start, so I used to cover Alabama for the Tuscaloosa News, and when I took that job back in 2021, someone told me that people would crawl through a field of broken glass naked for this job, and that to me was set the tone pretty early of just how important this job is to people in the state in terms of being able to cover and read about, not just me, but anyone who covers Alabama, just because people care that much about it. So I don't know, freak out, but that certainly stood out to me.
Yeah, well, on that note, he's Nick Kelly, Alabama football reporter. You can find all of his work, including this amazing series, on AL.com. You got to go check it out ASAP. Thank you, Nick. We appreciate you doing this. You can find Beat Everyone on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. We also want to thank Beat Everyone producer Matt Scalisi. Matt, thanks as always for doing what you did there with your earlier segment on players that we miss. We want to hear from you. What players do you miss? Sound off in the comments section as always. I'm Ben Flanagan with AL.com. Thank you. We're going to see you next time.